secured an appointment as editor of the German-French yearbook. Through this magazine he met a like-minded fellow contributor named Friedrich Engels, whose father owned cotton mills in the Rhineland and one in Manchester, England. The 23-year-old Engels had been working for the family business in Manchester for 2 years. In his spare time, however, he devoted himself to pursuing his revolutionary ideals, meeting Chartists and followers of Robert Owen, as well as attending communist meetings. Engels's dichotomies, unlike Marx's, were lived on the surface. A rebel at home, he nonetheless joined the family firm. Despite being a high school dropout at 17, he went on to learn more than a smattering of 24 languages. Although he functioned as a respectable businessman and member of the Cotton Exchange in Manchester, he also lived quite openly with his working-class girlfriend, an illiterate Irish redhead named Mary Burns. It was Mary who led him through the Irish slums off Oxford Road, dangerous areas for all but their inhabitants. During the course of these visits, Engels encountered the scenes that appeared in his groundbreaking work, The Condition of the Working Class in England. Masses of refuse, offal, and sickening filth lie among standing pools in all directions. The atmosphere is poisoned by the effluvia from these, and laden and darkened by the smoke of a dozen tall factory chimneys. A horde of ragged women and children swarm about here, as filthy as the swine that thrive upon the garbage heaps and in the puddles. The race that lives in these ruinous cottages, behind broken windows, or in dark wet cellars in measureless filth and stench, must really have reached the lowest stage of humanity. In each of these dens, containing at most 2 rooms, a garret, and perhaps a cellar, on the average 20 human beings live. Amazingly, this was in the year or so before the Irish potato famine, when 1 million would die and many more would be forced to emigrate, spilling into such little islands all over Britain and North America. Yet when Engels walked with a fellow businessman and pointed out how these slums were a disgrace to Manchester, his colleague merely listened politely and then remarked to him on parting, "And yet there is a great deal of money made here. Good morning, sir." Engels had briefly met Marx when he was editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, but on that occasion neither had been impressed. Not until Engels began submitting articles for the German-French yearbook did Marx recognize a true kindred spirit. The second time they met, Engels was enjoying a brief visit to Paris on his roundabout way home for a holiday. The communist bon viveur and the grubby cheroot-smoking journalist soon found they had much more in common than their large beards. During Engels's 10-day visit, the two of them struck up an immediate and profound rapport that would last a lifetime. Engels was the only friend with whom Marx never quarrelled. For his part, Engels worshipped Marx. The word is hardly too strong. He would devote much of his time and money in support of his hero friend, to say nothing of the emotional and physical energy involved in this exacting task. Although Marx was married and now had a baby daughter, he was still living the precarious attic life of a poor student. This, too, remained a permanent feature of Marx's life. As we shall see, it was due to something more than mere financial necessity. The lack of respectability or social responsibility appears to have fulfilled some unresolved psychological need. Marx remained poor for the rest of his life, yet it was never working-class poverty with the accompanying extreme squalor and despair, such as Engels had witnessed in Manchester. Marx's poverty was always more that of the perennial student fallen on hard times, often extremely hard times, but recognizably that of the improvident gent. Marx and Engels soon began using the German-French yearbook as a mouthpiece for their radical ideas, which in this way began circulating in Germany. The Prussian authorities soon began seizing copies of the magazine and put pressure on the French government to restrain Marx. As a result, the magazine was closed down, and Marx was expelled from France. Rather than return to Germany, he departed for Belgium, which had become independent just 14 years earlier, and took up residence in Brussels. The impecunious Marx family was increased to 4 when Jenny gave birth to a son. Engels followed Marx to Brussels, where they both joined the newly formed Communist League. In recognition of their journalistic prowess, Marx and Engels were given the task of writing a manifesto for the League. This is the origin of the first Manifesto of the Communist Party. From the very beginning it was something of a misnomer. There was no Communist Party. The Communist League was merely one of several groups that referred to themselves as communists. Likewise, the idea of producing a manifesto was not to proclaim communist policy, but to establish precisely what that policy was. Marx and Engels were expected to take the various woolly and disparate ideas that constituted communism and hammer them into some hard and fast definitive shape. This they would succeed in doing beyond the wildest dreams of their sponsors. The Communist Manifesto, as it is now more popularly known, eventually became one of the greatest worldwide bestsellers in the history of printing, along with the Bible and Shakespeare. There is no doubting that this 40-page document is the masterpiece of its kind. Its opening is suitably dramatic. A spectre is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. In an earlier draft, Engels defined communism as the doctrine of the conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat, that class of society which procures its means of livelihood entirely and solely from the sale of its labour. This would be achieved by the elimination of private property and its replacement by community of property. According to Marx, whose ringing phrases dominate the document, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. This had passed from the slave era through the feudal era to modern bourgeois society, where capitalists were able to dominate the proletariat because they owned the means of production, such as the machinery and the factories. Surprisingly, Marx was quite ready to admit the unparalleled achievements of the bourgeois age. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing the Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. But, and here comes the full weight of Marx's analysis, it has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervour, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless incontestable chartered freedoms has set up that single, unscrupulous freedom, free trade. The human richness of medieval life, such as still lingered in pre-industrial places like Trier, had given way to the industrial urban nightmare, such as could be witnessed from student attic windows in Berlin and Paris. Humanity had been dehumanized. Individual freedoms had been harnessed to free trade, the very factor which, according to Adam Smith, allowed the invisible hand of the market to do its work, providing benefit for all. Here, for the first time, was a trenchant analysis that was diametrically opposed to classical economics. The victory of the proletariat would bring about the first classless society. The market, free trade, these worked for the benefit of the capitalist at the expense of the proletariat, who were simply exploited. There was no point in reform. The only answer lay in the overthrow of capitalism. Despite this argument, in the Manifesto, Marx does offer a list of reforms for capitalism, those such as the progressive income tax, the abolition of child labour, and free education for all children we now accept as the norm. Others, such as the abolition of private property and the establishment of a state monopoly in banking, communications, transport, and all means of production, have been tried. The attempts to establish such utopian projects have forcefully brought home the actual meaning of the word utopia, which derives from the ancient Greek ou, meaning no, and topos, place. There is also a further recommendation by Marx which often escapes comment: confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. An odd suggestion, coming from an emigrant rebel, but since Marx seldom had any property, its author would presumably have remained unaffected by this draconian measure. The Manifesto ends with its celebrated call to arms. Communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletariat have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world, unite. Marx put the finishing touches to the Manifesto in January 1848. Although it was not circulated with sufficient speed or in sufficient numbers to have an immediate effect, there is no doubt that Marx caught the mood of the times. 1848 was to be the year of the revolutions throughout Europe. In spare time, however, he devoted himself to pursuing his revolutionary ideals, meeting Chartists and followers of Robert Owen, as well as attending communist meetings. Engels's dichotomies, unlike Marx's, were lived on the surface. A rebel at home, he nonetheless joined the family firm. Despite he earned an appointment as editor of the German-French yearbook. Through this magazine he met a like-minded fellow contributor named Friedrich Engels, whose father owned cotton mills in the Rhineland and one in Manchester, England. The 23-year-old Engels had been working for the family business in Manchester for 2 years. In his being a high school dropout at 17, he went on to learn more than a smattering of 24 languages. Although he functioned as a respectable businessman and member of the Cotton Exchange in Manchester, he also lived quite openly with his working-class girlfriend, an illiterate Irish redhead named Mary Burns. It was among standing pools in all directions. The atmosphere is poisoned by the effluvia from these, and laden and darkened by the smoke of a dozen tall factory chimneys. A horde of ragged women and children swarm about here, as filthy as the swine that thrive upon the garbage heaps and in the puddles. Mary, who led him through the Irish slums off Oxford Road, dangerous areas for all but their inhabitants. During the course of these visits, Engels encountered the scenes that appeared in his groundbreaking work, The Condition of the Working Class in England. Masses of refuse, offal, and sickening filth lie